With that, I choose to introduce our final speaker for the evening, Michelle Auerbach from the class of 2003 MFA Writing and Poetics in Prose and Fiction. Michelle Auerbach solves problems and creates change and community through story across diverse contexts. She works with businesses on change management, leadership, and creativity through story. She works with communities on creating social good connection and working across differences towards beloved community through story. She coaches and teaches individuals through workshops, trainings, and one-on-one explorations. She writes for the New York Times, the London Guardian, and is the author of 3 books: Resilience, The Life-Saving Skill of Story, Alice Modern, and A Third Kind of Horse. Let us welcome Michelle Auerbach for her Spark Talk, The Beloved Community is Made of Stories.
So I noticed listening to these talks that beloved community calls us to do something that's emerged from listening to these wonderful people talk. It calls us to talk about stuff that's the society would rather us keep quiet. Or beloved community wants us to share the things that society tells us are our own fault, or that society wants to cover up through some kind of bypass, spiritual, historical. I think that we're at the point where we realize that this just isn't working. At least for me, it's impossible to keep my mouth shut when I see injustice, blame, shame, trauma, oppression, and hate. And my family will tell you it gets me into some trouble. But I'll tell you, it's really necessary to be able to discuss the tough stuff without defensiveness if we're going to create beloved community. So with that, I'll tell you that I cannot seem to get my mother-in-law to agree with me on politics. Okay, so I know this sounds like the setup to a joke, and it very well may be, but my stepkids think I'm crazy and they roll their eyes and slink out of the room when I try to directly engage with her about our beliefs, but I can't let it go. I know under all the differences, and they're glaring, that she's a good-hearted person capable of enormous empathy and care. So I keep going into the conversation the same way. I state my belief: more people need to get taken care of better in this country. And then she argues her belief from her generation and culture that the rules in the system are working and we have to support it. We have to live our traditions. We have to have rules. And suddenly we're alone in the living room. Everyone else has snuck out and we're going nowhere. So I wrote about this in my book, Resilience, the Life-Saving Skill of Story, and I gave away the secret to success, which I have to admit, since she's read the book, she knows exactly what I'm up to, but so far it's still working. Instead of arguing with her about the facts, since her sources are so different from mine, I take a tactic that research has shown us over and over works across political and cultural lines and brings people together. I tell stories, and she tells stories. And in there, we find a common set of beliefs that allow us to navigate the otherwise completely overwhelming gulf that's developed between who she's going to vote for and who I'm going to vote for. Story, according to all research, bridges gaps. It also makes data real. It facilitates change. It brings us to places where we could never go any other way. All of our learning, our ability to change, our empathy, our connection to other humans, and our ability to live a good life and to make sure and care about the fact that everyone else lives a good life too, comes from storytelling and listening. All the skills we need to be resilient in crisis, we learn through story. And all the skills we have that we need to share with others, we share through story. And you've seen it done tonight brilliantly, as Shatasia shared her stories, as Elizabeth shared her stories, as Don explained to us the stories of Dr. King and his community. Story mediates our world and ourselves in ways that increase our adaptability and improve our world. It's not complicated. It already lives in our brains and bodies and minds, and we can access it with a little practice, which you've done tonight, and some remembering of the skills we all had as children, both to make up stories and to hear them. Once we get fluent in storytelling and story listening, we are able to adapt, learn, teach, share, understand, and cope in ways that will allow us to move with change and lend a hand when the people around us are not moving, or when the people around us need change and it's not happening. The process is available to all of us. It transforms us and our lives, and it really can save the world. Stories what got me into the work of social justice when I was just a kid. We were moving into middle school from elementary school, so I was 12 years old when I went to a very integrated elementary school. What that looks like in Cleveland in 1978 was that the Black kids, the white kids, and the Jewish kids all hung out together. So the first week of middle school, for a lot of reasons we did not understand or see coming, this came to an abrupt end. If you'd looked at the lunchroom at Woodbury Junior High, you would have thought segregation was mandatory, and it really hurt. But I didn't know it hurt anyone but me. In high school, we were finally able, with some critical thinking skills, some perspective, and some courage, to reach out and talk to the other kids with whom we'd been close once, but weren't anymore. And I was actually able to say out loud that it hurt me. We didn't have a really advanced language for race issues, but we told our stories and listened to each other and realized that no one wanted it this way. Again, no advanced process, understanding of the larger social structures of oppression, of the redlining that had gone into where people went to middle school. We didn't understand any of that. But we got the teacher who thought this was important to support us, and we decided we were going to go talk to sixth graders from our elementary school about what happened and tell our stories. We had no solution. We had no answers for them about what they could do to avoid it, but we had heart, courage, and we had a real desire to spare them what I would now call the racial reckoning of middle school. We went into the sixth grade classroom powered only by story, and we talked and we listened. This was about 35 years ago, and the program of high school students talking to elementary school students about race still exists in that school system. We're all long gone. Our kids are out of school too. The teacher who sponsored us has moved and retired, but the storytelling caught on as a way for a very diverse place to try to talk about justice. And the community we created was a beloved one, and it still exists. We know a lot more now about why and how this works, this storytelling genius, through neuroscience and an interest in how the brain works when it's being run on story. We know that several things happen when we listen to and tell our stories. The first one is we build attention. Even in this very fractured world, it's amazing that I can barely keep myself from doom scrolling news sources on my phone. But if I'm reading a good book or watching the latest episode of Pose with my sweetie, I'm in another world and my attention is captured for a moment. I am what the research calls transported. I'm in someone else's experience and it's real to me in that moment in the ways my living room is not. Being in someone else's reality is the direct path to empathy, and something we really need to practice right now. No matter how hard it is, and no matter how much we're trained or people tell us don't feel it, ignore it, because the system works better if you don't go there, transportation and empathy allow us to humanize each other. And empathy is the crux of storytelling. If you have a character and a plot, you're able to build empathy and care. And I'm not just talking about fiction stories and movies, but the stories we tell each other about who we are, about the world we live in. The stories we use and tell and listen to with our kids and our friends and our lovers and our coworkers, with strangers, even with the people who we politically wildly disagree with. And all the research tells you that basic empathy skills are part of how we break down the barriers between us. We shorten the distance from our hearts to our brains in a real psychological and physiological way. And we need that right now. The divisions in our country are being exposed they existed, right? I think Shateja said this, 400 years of these divisions, but they're being exposed and purposely irritated and agitated, or else they're being exposed and we're being told to ignore them. And we need to talk about subjects that the system in this country has either avoided, not looked at, tried to suppress, and we need to do it in ways that bring us into deeper, more beloved, inclusive, just community. We're having to talk about things that were born out of trauma, oppression, and supremacy, and we have to do it with grace, kindness, and transformation. Speaking to his supporters at the end of the Montgomery bus boycott in 1956, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. declared that the common goal was not simply the end of segregation as an institution. Rather, he said, the end is reconciliation. The end is redemption. The end is the creation of a beloved community. But he never said beloved community was easy. And nothing about his story would leave us thinking that this undertaking is simple. It asks us to get up close and personal with people who are different than us and with the ugliest parts of ourselves. It asks us to find a way to talk to people with whom we radically disagree, some of whom are also living in our heads. And it asks us to find the materials for and then build a foundation that can flex with difference, dance with integrity, and move with energy. There really is no being alive in 2020 and not experiencing trauma in one or several of the ways that trauma happens to us. Our own trauma, intergenerational trauma, secondary or historic trauma, systemic trauma, and we need to pay attention to it, especially the trauma of folks who've been told their lives don't matter, and we need to center it instead of sweeping it under the rug. Trauma is something that story deals with particularly well, perhaps because it's something that our wisdom and our faith traditions learned over millennia to use story as a balm for. If you need a narrative of a person giving up privilege, take a look at the Buddha. If you need a narrative of a person centering the oppressed, visit with Jesus. If you need a narrative about community and the powers of story to heal us as individuals, visit with the Bhagavad Gita. If you need a narrative of surviving a narrow place and slavery, lean into Exodus from the Tanakh and the Jewish tradition, as many liberation theologians have. If you need a story about love and devotion to something bigger, being a buoyant force, visit with the mystical side of Islam. All of these traditions have taught us to be with hard things, even when we've been traumatized, and to learn how and why we would do this through story. We need to be able to sit with hard feelings and learn to tolerate discomfort. One of my favorite teachers, Angel Kyoto Williams, tells us that we have no education and no training in being uncomfortable. And we need that training to do the work of justice. Well, with story, we have the training. Story helps us come from where we are, reach and be transported to where somebody else is, and co-regulate it to help each other sit in it, even when we're uncomfortable, and take it in. I had the privilege last week to be part of a storytelling process created by the Modus Theater Company here in Boulder. We collaborated on a series of conversations, and the most recent one was on the criminal legal system and the experiences of formerly incarcerated folks. I got to hear a story by a very gifted storyteller named Daniel Guillory. He's a minister in his community and a recovering addict and was incarcerated. And he tells the story of being in prison and getting out, trying to stay clean. And it was so hard to sit still. Daniel's this amazingly engaging guy. He's got this infectious smile and his feelings come through clear as a bell. I found myself rising up with him as he got released from prison and falling into the depths of hell as he started using again. When he got to the part where he asked his mother, while he was high, if she wished she had not bailed him out, my heart was breaking and I couldn't breathe. I was waiting for that final blow that would destroy him and by extension me. Instead, his mother said she would always bail him out. And he looked fiercely into the camera and said, "Grace is the best teacher. Sure, punishment can change your behavior, but grace changes your mind." In that moment, I saw the path to being Daniel himself or being Daniel's mother as the path to beloved community. They sat still in that discomfort and they learned. And because they could, Daniel could talk to us about it. And because I could listen to him, I can sit still with it. It was mind training in being present when it hurts. This training is how we will change the system, create beloved community, make sure more people get taken care of better right now. Your version of this might just be to go back and listen to Shateja's talk again and let it transport you into her reality and be willing to sit there, as painful as it is, because as we do this for each other, we create beloved community. When I was a child, I had a babysitter who told me vampire stories, and I loved them. I loved the fear they created in my body, the racing heart, the sharpness of my mind when I was totally petrified. I kept looking for those feelings when I watched movies, and I would sneak disaster movies like The Towering Inferno. I even watched The Exorcist one night while my parents were out alone in the basement. Not recommended when you're like 10. The feeling of being alive and riveted kept me coming back even though I couldn't sleep. My mother would say goodnight, turn off the light in my room, and walk out. And what was a bright, cheerful, yellow room during the day became a landscape of potential disasters, horrible monsters, and hell as soon as the light went off. I would imagine just how many vampires could hide in my closet, what I would do if fire blocked me from the door to the hall, that if I had to slide down the roof into the lilac bush, swing down and run through the back alley to the neighbor's house to call the fire department, I could do it before it killed my family. I stayed awake for hours every night, alert, sharp, ready to fight. And because of my nighttime vigilance, I fell asleep everywhere else. Anywhere that the light was on, I could sleep. Finally, after months of this, one night I crept out of my bed, flung the closet door open, and pulled the cord to turn the light on. The room immediately glowed warm, and I got back in bed. With the closet door open and the light on, I could sleep. I slept with the light on until I went away to college. Embarrassing, but true. But I was safe when I could see the room around me. The boring laundry basket was just a laundry basket. The electric sockets were not sparking killer flames. There was nothing hiding under my bed. But more than that, the light was protection against the terrors that I knew permeated the world. Story is that light we turn on for ourselves and for each other. It's how we bring our deepest fears into our waking lives and meet up with them courageously. In this moment, when all our fears for survival are heightened, and when we are anxious because we just don't know what's next, we're probably not sleeping all that well. We need to turn the light on so that we can see our way to love, peace, security, trust, and care, what we want for ourselves, what we want for each other. Story is the light we turn on for ourselves and each other, and it draws us close. Howard Thurman tells us that being part of something bigger than ourselves brings us the courage and the power to sit with the tough stuff. Howard Thurman is a theologian and was one of the people who Dr. King carried Thurman's book everywhere in his briefcase. And Dr. Thurman picked up Dr. King's work and continued to write and speak about the beloved community. And he said one could lose fear by the sense of being part of a company of people who share the same concerns and are conscious of participating in the same collective destiny. This is an additional form that the feeling of community inspires, he tells us. A strange and wonderful courage often comes into one's life when they share a commitment to something that is more important than whether they live or die. It is the discovery of the dynamic character of life itself. So story asks us that radical question. Where do you stand? Who do you stand with? Who do you bring into your circle? How do you learn that strange and wonderful courage that we need to sit with the difficulties this task asks of us? How do we share the best of who we are and what we're capable of and never judge each other by the worst things we've done? Story provides solutions and brings us into the skills and tools we need for a beloved community. When I was writing that book and thinking about how story really is a life-saving skill, I thought about who is in my beloved community, whose resilience and power, dreams and courage, whose traditions and transformation I surround myself with. And I realized that the list was long and varied, but it was all about storytellers and writers and storytellers in community like James Baldwin, who was a preacher and a writer, teachers and preachers like Angel Kyoto Williams, friends and family who have stood up against violence for their communities, activists like Larry Kramer and my friends in ACT UP, and current dreamers and doers like Adrienne Marie Brown and Alexis Pauline Gumbs. And what they all have in common is that they open doors and hearts with story. They bring us in to learn and love, and they send us out to change and act, all the while filling us with the power that is love. You here listening to this, you are a community builder, a change maker, and a storyteller. You have all the skills you need from the stories that have fed you. Go out and make beloved community. Seek, be brave, tell stories, because you are storytellers and you are saving lives. Thank you.